Father, thank you so much for your grace and your goodness to us, above all in the gift of your Son, Jesus. And as we sit with this letter your servant Paul wrote, I pray that your Holy Spirit would enlighten the eyes of our hearts, that we may see and grasp and understand the treasures that you have for us here, that our hearts might grip and hold on to them, and we might be moved by who Christ is, and that we might be transformed by his presence with us. And my prayer is that as we study this book, we would leave as changed people, people who have grown more and more like Christ because of spending time in your word. And so would you bless our study together? We pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right, like you guys, I'm excited to study Colossians. It is a rich and thick book, or letter actually, and it's actually a lot's going on in a very short amount of time. And so it's one of Paul's shorter letters. And so let's just jump right in. I'm going to kind of walk through a just general introduction to what Colossians is, and then we're going to address kind of what the background is going on that occasions this letter that Paul writes. So first is, this is a letter Paul wrote to the church in Colossae. So the author is Paul, and actually what you see if you read there in Colossians chapter 1, verse 1, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother. So what this is telling us is that Colossians was a collaborative effort between Paul and Timothy. They actually wrote the letter together. Will likely contribute to different style differences between, say, the letter here to the Colossians and the letter to the Ephesians, is Timothy's actually contributing to this letter as well. We also know from the end of Colossians chapter 4, that there's a number of companions with Paul that are kind of a part of the formation of this letter. So a man named Tychicus, a man named Aristarchus, a man named Mark, a man named Epaphras, who we'll spend a little more time on in a moment, the good Dr. Luke, and a man named Demas. And so all these people are kind of in Paul's inner circle, and this is because Paul is in prison. If you were with us through the study of Acts, where we leave off the book of Acts is Paul in prison and basically house arrest in the city of Rome. And this is the group of people that has traveled with him and is now kind of addressing and taking care of Paul's very kind of practical needs, but also they are kind of his eyes and ears out into the world of what's happening in all the churches that have recently been planted. And so it's likely because of this group of people that's with Paul that he has gotten wind of what's going on at the church in Colossae. So there's this kind of, think of it as like a small group of guys who are all kind of huddled together in a small house, or a kind of, maybe not even a house, but kind of some sort of like block space where they're all talking together about what God is doing in the life of the church at this point. Tychicus and Aristarchus, as I mentioned a moment ago, they're also mentioned in the book of Acts. They are partners with Paul that join with him in his missionary journey. So they've been with him for some time now. We also know Mark. Mark was the cause of a dispute that emerged between Barnabas and Paul, which led to their ministries going separate ways. They got in some kind of a conflict over Mark, or as he's also known, John Mark, and this led to a division in their ministries. But by this point, it seems like Mark and Paul have been restored. So we don't know the specifics of what Mark did or what occasioned this conflict. All we know is that it led to a conflict, led to a division, but by this point Mark has been restored to the Apostle Paul. We also know that Epaphras is part of this inner circle. Epaphras, what we'll see in a moment, he was actually the one who planted the church in Colossae. So it's likely through him that the information about what's going on in this church is brought to the Apostle Paul. There's also Luke, the author of the book of Acts, as well as the Gospel of Luke. He's kind of in this inner circle. And then this man named Demas. 2 Timothy 4 tells us that Demas ultimately abandons the Apostle Paul and likely gives up on his faith and turns back toward the world and the things of the world. So quite a crew here with the Apostle Paul. We also know that the date of this letter is somewhere between AD 60 and 62. So this is approximately 30 years after Jesus' resurrection from the dead. And we know that the letter is written in this period because this is when Paul was in prison in Rome. And so if you follow along in the story of Acts, Paul goes on several different missionary journeys. And then by the time we get to his imprisonment, it's about AD 60, AD 62. He's not going to die too much longer after this, actually. So AD 60, 62. This is also called one of Paul's prison letters because he's obviously writing it from prison. We also can read about that in the other prison letters are Ephesians, Philippians, and the book of Philemon. And so I'll talk about Philemon in a moment. But this is kind of what's going on here, just general information. And then the recipients. So this is actually, if you go to the city of Rome, this is traditionally known as the location where Paul was under house arrest. It's a location you can actually go visit today. And so Paul was in prison writing this letter, and he's writing it to the church in Colossae, which was planted by Epaphras. So Paul mentions Epaphras in the beginning of the letter. If you look with me there in Colossians chapter 1, he is talking about the gospel that's spreading and bearing fruit and increasing throughout the whole world. And then he tells us in verse 7, just as you learned it, the gospel, from Epaphras, our beloved fellow servant. He is a faithful minister of Christ on your behalf and has made known to us your love in the Spirit. So Epaphras is the church planter. He's the one who starts the Colossian church. And it is likely the church tradition is that Epaphras was converted by the Apostle Paul in the city of Ephesus. So on Paul's third missionary journey, he ends up staying in the city of Ephesus for a couple years. And the tradition has it that Epaphras was converted in the city of Ephesus, which wasn't too far from the ancient city of Colossae. Just to give you a little bit of frame of reference, the ancient city of Colossae, so this is modern-day Turkey right here. This is Greece and Italy right here. Colossae was in the southwestern part of Turkey. So here's the city of Ephesus, here's Colossae, and it's a city that's on the Meander River, and it's close to a well-known city, Laodicea. So if you read the book of Revelation, a letter was written to this church. There's also the city of Hierapolis, and this marks a road that went through Colossae, Laodicea, and all the way down to the west coast of Turkey. This road leads all the way to the Persian Empire. So it's a major trade route, and that's what leads to a lot of the prosperity that happens along this trade route. So Colossae is a pretty prosperous city, so is Laodicea. It wouldn't be long after this, actually, that the trade route changes, and it goes around the city of Colossae and then down to Laodicea. And so it's not long after this that actually the city of Colossae basically disappears. This mound right here is part of the ancient city of Colossae. This is a mountain that's right behind it, but it is a place you can visit today. There's ancient ruins there. You can go learn all about the ancient city of Colossae. But Epaphras, like I said, was a Colossian. He was a native of the city of Colossae. You read that in Colossians chapter 4, verse 12, where Paul says that he's one of you. In other words, he's a native of the city of Colossae. So this is why we are pretty sure that what's going on is Epaphras is traveling to Rome. He's been in the church in Colossae. He's traveling to Rome, and he's reporting to Paul what's going on in the church. And this is what kind of inspires the Apostle Paul to write a letter to address some of the things that are happening in the life of the church. Based on all this information, we know that the church in Colossae is about 5 to 10 years old at the point of this letter being written. We also know that the church in Colossae was in the house of Philemon. So the letter to Philemon at the end of Paul's letters was written to Philemon, and we're told there that the church met in his house. So remember, back in this day and age, churches didn't have buildings and facilities. They just met in wealthy people's homes that had bigger space to host more people. Philemon was one of these. The reason why we have the letter to Philemon is Paul writes him about Philemon's former slave, a man named Onesimus. And Onesimus runs away from Philemon's household, and it causes this major break and rupture in their relationship. But Onesimus ends up converting to Christ and becoming a very helpful companion to Paul. And so Paul's going to write to Philemon and say, hey, Philemon, Onesimus is coming back, and I want you to welcome him back as a brother. And trying to kind of ease the tensions that might have occurred because of this rupture that happened some years before. So, this is the recipients, and then what occasions the letter. So, Paul gets this report back that there is an unnamed false teacher who's exerting his influence on the church. There's this false teaching that's being spread through the church. Like I said, he's unnamed. We don't know who he is, but we do know there is one specific person he has in mind. So if you look with me in Colossians chapter 2, there in verse 18, the Apostle Paul writes this: "Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism, worship of angels, going on in detail about visions, puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind." So he has one specific character in mind here. Whoever he is, he's got a sensuous mind, that is a mind set on the flesh. He's kind of preoccupied with himself. And he's exerting an influence on the church. And this influence is alarming to the Apostle Paul, such that he's going to write a letter. Now, that may not seem very, very significant to us, because for us, if we're like upset about something, we could fire off a quick text message or type an email out and send it out real quick. Well, in the ancient world, the construction of a letter was a costly exercise. It likely would cost several $1,000s to compose a letter, because you had to have papyrus or parchment, which is stretched out animal skin, which is very expensive to make. You had to have somebody who was skilled in writing, because many people were illiterate at this point. And you had to have somebody who knew how to use the space because you have one parchment, and you want to make sure you get as much information as possible on that so you don't have to pay for a second piece of parchment. And so you had to have somebody who is skilled in fitting everything in one space, right? So they got to think through the entirety of what they're writing before they even start. And so it's an expensive enterprise. So when Paul's writing here, this isn't like he's just firing off a quick angry email about what's going on. This is Paul deliberately and prayerfully considering about what he needs to say to these people to correct what's going on. And the effect of this false teaching is a loss in confidence that this church is having. A loss in confidence in the supremacy and the sufficiency of Jesus. In the supremacy and sufficiency of Jesus. And so Paul's going to write. He's going to write to them to address this false teaching and to rebuild confidence in this church. That all that they need is in Jesus. They need to look nowhere else besides him. So look with me, Colossians chapter 2, verse 8, probably one of the key verses in the whole letter to the Colossian church. He says this: "See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elementary spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. For in him the fullness of deity dwells bodily, and in him you have been filled, who is the head of all rule and authority." So what Paul is saying is, don't get taken captive. Don't be deceived by these other forms of teaching. Everything that you need, the fullness of what's been given to you has been given to you in Christ. So that's the basic gist of the letter. So what we're going to do today really is just focus on this false teaching. Get a sense of what it is, because it will help us as we go through the letter, and it'll help bring clarity to the different kinds of language and arguments that the Apostle Paul builds to correct this false teaching. And also it'll give us a sense of kind of the scope of what Paul is attempting to do in the whole letter. So with that being said, though, if at any point you guys have a question or you don't understand something, please stop me, and I'll also leave room at the end for any questions or comments that you might have. All right. We good? Okay. So let's look at this Colossian, what's famously called the Colossian heresy. The Colossian heresy. So the context, let me go back here. The context here is that there's a lot of religious things happening at this time. A lot of religious movements and change and disruption happening at this time. And there's a process that's happening that we really start to see here in the letter to the Colossians, a process called syncretism. And what syncretism is basically this. The idea that you grab a little bit of this religious belief, a little bit of that religious belief, a little bit of that religious belief, and you kind of you throw it into the blender and you make like a religious smoothie out of it. And you just blend them all together, and then now you have something new, right? Well, this is what's going on in Colossae at the time. And what we're going to see is that this heresy is a mixture of kind of three different streams of thought that kind of build this false teaching together, this kind of religious smoothie that's been produced. All right? You have a quote there from Dr. Clint Arnold. He's one of the top scholars on the book of Colossians. And he says this, that the Colossians tried to combine the apostles' teaching about Christ with local pagan and Jewish folk beliefs. Okay, so it's kind of this attempt to hold together all these different ideas. And that's what's going on with this heresy. So the first heresy, the first element or stream that's contributing to this heresy is Jewish mysticism. So there are lots of different ways to practice the Jewish faith. And even still today, if you were to know much about how the Jewish faith is practiced, there's lots of different ways that people practice this faith. One of the major strands that was really beginning to develop at this time was the practice of Jewish mysticism. And this mysticism was called Merkabah mysticism. Merkabah mysticism. You don't need to be a Hebrew scholar here, but that's what they call this form of mysticism. And that word Merkabah, it means chariot throne. That's what it means. And this form of mysticism actually emerges from the prophet Ezekiel. So if you go back in your Bibles and you read Ezekiel chapter 1, some of you have probably read this passage before and you thought, that's probably one of the weirder things I've ever read in the entire Bible. Ezekiel, the prophet, he's been taken captive. He's outside the city of Babylon, and he has this vision of the divine chariot throne. And if you remember, it's the wheels within the wheels, and there's eyes all over them, and then there's these creatures with wings over there. They're covering their feet, and are flapping, and are making all kinds of crazy noise, and they have different faces on their heads, and it's like, what is happening? You know, it seems like a psychedelic kind of trip or something like that. Well, this is Ezekiel's experience of God's chariot, God's throne that's kind of sitting upon this chariot, coming, his divine presence coming and revealing himself to the prophet Ezekiel. Well, these Jewish mystics, this is their goal is to have a visionary experience like Ezekiel had. They want to see this chariot throne. Now, we don't know for a fact that this is the mystical practice in Colossae, that this is what's being talked about. But what we do know from history is that this mystical practice was really began to be really popular during this time, and it spread all over the Roman Empire. So, through a kind of set of practices and asceticism, if you gave yourself sufficiently to these practices, you too could have an experience, a visionary experience like Ezekiel had. You could see God's heavenly throne. One scholar said it this way: there was present as early as the 1st century BC a form of religious mysticism which was to endure for centuries. This form was known as Merkabah mysticism. So, this is related to our text, 2:18. The Apostle Paul warns about this false teacher who goes on in detail about visions. So that's kind of the basis of this false teaching, is this false teacher is saying he's having these great and wonderful and very detailed visionary experiences. Okay? These details also include the veneration or worship of angels, which Paul also mentions here. He talks about it here. Verse 18, let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism and the worship of angels. So, a rabbi during this period writes this: a Jewish variation on one of the chief preoccupations of the 2nd and 3rd century Gnostics and Hermetics was the ascent of the soul from the earth through the spheres of hostile planet angels and rulers of the cosmos, and its return to its divine home in the fullness of God's light, a return which to the Gnostics' mind signified redemption. So I'll talk about Gnosticism here. He uses the word hermetics. That comes from the word hermit, somebody who goes away, kind of like a monk or something like that. And this was a very common practice during this period. So, the idea here is that there is God's throne, right? Let's put some wheels on it. He's got a wheelchair. There's God's throne, and it's at the center of different realms of heaven. Okay? It's at the center of different realms of heaven. And these realms are protected by guardian angels. These angels protect God's throne. Some of this is rooted in some biblical ideas. So if you remember, for example, in the very first story in the Bible, in Genesis 3, right after the fall, God's presence is guarded by a cherubim with a flaming sword, right? And so we also know that, for example, in the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant had two angels covering it, right, as a kind of form of protection. And so these guardian angels protect God's throne. They're sort of like the watchdogs or the junkyard dogs of heaven, right? They kind of keep an eye out on things for God. And so the idea here is that the mystic is somebody who wants to get all the way here, to have this experience of seeing God's throne, right? That's the aim, that's the goal. And in order to get there, you got to pass through these different levels. It's sort of like a video game, right? And you pass through these different levels, but at each level, just like a video game, you have a boss, right? That's at the end of each level that you got to beat the boss, right? Well, here there's these angels, and you've got to offer this angel a proper form of worship or veneration. Show this angel the proper or due respect that he's owed. And if you do so, he will let you into the next level. And I'll say more about what's in each level, but that's the idea, is you gotta offer these angels the proper amount of honor and respect that they are due, so that they'll let you in. And if you don't, one of the things that was really interesting doing my study this past couple weeks is people would have these encounters with these beings, and it would crack their minds, like they would lose their mind, or some of them would die. And so it was like they were serious about this, right? You got to be prepared to face these angel guardians if you want to go to the next level of your experience. So, how do you do that? How do you pass through these levels? And again, this is part of a somewhat biblical worldview. So the Apostle Paul will talk about his own visionary experience in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And he talks about passing into the third heavens, right? And he sees things there that he can't even speak about, right? And so there is this idea that's somewhat in Scripture itself. But these Jewish mystics are saying, I've got the process worked out, okay? And here's how you're going to do it. Through mysticism and asceticism. So, the mystical part is the experience. And in each of these levels, there will be mysteries, secret knowledge. And as you get to each level, you'll gain new secret knowledge. And that secret knowledge will enable you to get to the next level, right? So that's what this mystical faith was all about. So, how did you prepare yourself to face these angel guardians? Well, two basic things. First, you needed to follow God's law perfectly. So here's one of my favorite sentences I read this week from F.F. Bruce. He's a commentator on the book of Colossians. And he says this, that you had to have punctilious observance of the minutiae of the law. punctilious. What a great word. I was like, I got to start using that word, punctilious. Of the minutia. So you got to follow the law perfectly, exactly to its finest detail. You cannot fail in one single part if you want to ascend through these levels. Well, how do we know this is a part of the Colossian heresy? Well, look with me at Colossians 2, verse 16. Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, so things like kosher diet, or with regard to festivals, or new moons, or Sabbaths. Okay, so these are all aspects of the Jewish law, or the Torah. You had to keep, there were certain festivals that you had to keep. You had to strictly keep the Sabbath. You had to strictly observe the dietary restrictions of the Jewish law, so what we know as the kosher laws. Right, so it's strict adherence to the law. And if you can do this, and a lot of the laws that are mentioned here are associated with what are called the purity laws in the Old Testament. So if you ever want to go back, which very few of you ever will want to go back to the book of Leviticus, which is like the weirdest book in the Bible. And there's a bunch of what are called purity laws, right? And these are ways that Israel is supposed to keep itself pure. And the whole idea of keeping these specific laws is that you're pure enough to go through these different levels, right? And so we see this in language about do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. There in Colossians 2:21. If you keep yourself pure and unstained from all these pollutants, right? Not only this, so you got to follow the law strictly. And you also have to practice a very extreme form of asceticism. And that you may not necessarily know what that word asceticism means, but it basically means training. So there are forms of Christian asceticism that are perfectly fine and wonderful, but that word here, it's being used by Paul here to talk about a very extreme form of training. We can see it here in verse 23. He says, these have indeed the appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body. So these would be extreme practices of fasting, right? If you've ever read about a lot of like some of the yogis in Hinduism and like the extreme asceticism, like some of these guys will like bury themselves in the dirt for like 30 years, you know. I don't even know how you do that, right? But this is what these extreme, harsh practices that are meant to show that you have mastery over your physical body. And so if you keep the law perfectly and you show that you have mastery of your body, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, because your body's going to be a problem and you got to get mastery over it. And so if you can get mastery over your body and you keep the law, you will show yourself worthy to get to the next level. But if you get there and you haven't done enough, these angels are going to come at you, and it's not going to go well for you. So this is the whole basic idea of the Jewish mystical world. This Jewish practice of Jewish mysticism, one of the modern or contemporary expressions of this is the practice in Judaism called Kabbalah. It's very rigorously practiced by a lot of Jews today. You'll note it. You can probably see it if you ever see a Jew wearing a bracelet that's a red thread. That would be an indicator that they're a practitioner of Kabbalah, which is basically a modern version of what I just described to you. Okay, so this is kind of going on. There's a major Jewish population in Colossae at this time, and this is a part of the practice that's going on in Judaism at the time. Not only that, but then there is, another part I forgot to mention about this is these are amulets. And if you go to Jerusalem today and you go to the old city of Jerusalem, you'll see these like everywhere. And a major part of Jewish mysticism was the practice of magic. And through various spells and incantations and amulets, you could get these angels on your side and they would protect you from other evil spirits. That's basically the idea. So if you go to Judaism today, you can find and purchase for yourself your own personal amulet that will protect you from evil spirits. right? That's the idea here. All right, so there's Jewish mysticism going on. That's kind of in the, that's one of the ingredients that's going to go in that religious smoothie that we're making. Another ingredient is folk religion. So folk religion at the time, this is, what I'm going to say here is basically true about most folk religions all throughout the world. They have a lot of things that are actually in common. The names of their gods, some of their practices are different, but these are things that basically hold most folk religions in common. And what it is invoking angelic protection against evil spirits through the use of magic, taboos, and amulets. So, the folk religion, what they're primarily concerned about is what are called the elemental spirits. And Paul actually talks about them here in Colossians chapter 2, verse 8. He says, "See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elementary spirits of the world." These elementary spirits are called in Greek stoicheia. Think of it this way. They are like the spirits of the air, the spirits of the earth, the spirits of the forest, right? They manage and oversee different aspects of the world. And these spirits are dangerous and threatening. And they could affect you at any given moment on any given day because your life is constantly surrounded by them. And what you need is protection from them. And so what you're going to do is you're going to engage in a magical practice where you use an incantation. And this incantation is going to appeal to an angel that you've come to learn their name. That's going to be an important part of it. You need to know the angel's name. And you're going to call upon this angel. And this angel, because you've done this incantation just precisely the right way, you can't screw it up because then the angel will be upset with you. But if you do it just the right way, this angel will agree to protect you from these elemental spirits, these stoicheia. This is basic folk religion in its simplest. And you also, there are also taboos. These are like words that you, for example, words that you can't say. Because if you say that word, the elemental spirit, the stoicheia, it's going to come after you. So don't say certain kinds of words, don't touch certain kinds of things, don't go certain places, because these are ways that the stoicheia can gain access to you and really mess up your life. So this is all a part of this folk religion. And one of the ways that you also protected yourself was through amulets. So this is very similar to the Jewish mysticism. You wear certain charms around your neck or on your wrists or around your ankles, and these are going to be ways that forms of protection. These amulets have special written words on them that are supposed to ward off these evil spirits. They've been blessed in certain kinds of ways by different priests or shamans or witch doctors that have now said, okay, these amulets have special power to protect you from evil spirits. So there's this kind of folk religion that's going on at the time. There's this Jewish mysticism that's going on at the time. And third and finally, Gnosticism. So Gnosticism doesn't really become a belief system till some 100 years after this. But what we see going on in the letter to the Colossians is the beginnings of this belief system. And Gnosticism, there's not one kind of Gnosticism. There's lots of different kinds of Gnosticisms. And I'll explain what the name Gnosticism means. But it ends up becoming, by the time we get to like the 200s and 300s, so several hundred years after the time of Christ, this ends up becoming a major force, religious force in the Roman world. Many, 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 many people embrace Gnosticism. And Gnosticism is sort of like if we were making kind of a religious smoothie, Gnosticism would be like taking all the smoothies together and making a giant smoothie. It blends together folk religion and Greek philosophy and Judaism and Christianity and other religious systems, and it just kind of holds them all together in this jumble of. And so if you were to read any Gnostic texts from the ancient world, you could read, I mean, they could all seem very, very different to you, because it's depending on where you're at, the different practitioners of Gnosticism had very different beliefs. But they have some things that are all in common, which are a part of what's going on here at Colossae. What are those things they have in common? Well, one, initiation into secret knowledge or the mysteries. That's a huge part of Gnosticism. There is secret knowledge out there, and you can have access to it. And a body-spirit dualism. So I'll talk more about this in a moment, but basically, body bad, spirit good. Okay? So, the initiation into secret knowledge. So, the idea here is that, so Gnosticism, it comes from the Greek word gnosis, which just means to know. And that's this idea of secret knowledge. There's this secret knowledge that is there to be had. And the way that you have this is at these various levels of the spiritual realm are hidden these mysteries. And if you go through the proper rites and rituals, you can gain access to this special knowledge. How many of you have ever heard of the Book of Enoch? Okay, Jerry, just a few of you. Okay, so the Book of Enoch, it's recently become a much bigger deal, but the Book of Enoch emerged during this period. It's not a Gnostic text, but it tells us a little bit about the way the world and the Jewish world and the broader Greek world thought at this time. And so really think of the Book of Enoch as sort of a commentary on the first 11 chapters of the Book of Genesis, kind of especially the pre-flood time. And one of the things that it talks about, for example, is if you follow the story of Cain, right, after he kills his brother Abel, he goes off and he forms these cities. And then his offspring are the ones that develop the first forms of human technology. So agricultural technology, or implements of war, or musical instruments, right? And what the Book of Enoch tells us is that, well, how did they get that knowledge? How did they know it's probably not good to eat this plant, it's poisonous, but these plants are really good to eat? How did they know about how to develop agriculture? How did they know about how you can take like the guts of a sheep and use those guts to make a string, which they still do today? They make violin strings out of the guts of a sheep. How did they know that? How did they know that you can shape a piece of wood into these unique shapes and get a certain kind of sound out of it? How did they come to learn about metallurgy and how to break down and smelt iron to make a weapon or to make bronze? How did they learn all of this? Well, what the Book of Enoch says is that there are these angels, and they have secret knowledge. And what they did is they passed that secret knowledge on. They were the ones that taught human beings about how to do these things. Right? And so this is the way in the first century, the time that the letter to Colossians was being written, this is how they understood how all this came about. Is that there were these mysteries about, you can say something like this today. And you can go read this. This is super fascinating. How do all these like tech entrepreneurs know how to do all the different things they're doing? Well, some of these guys will explicitly say, I was on a psychedelic trip and I encountered a spiritual being on my psychedelic trip and he told me. Like some of these guys are saying this, right? And so they're gaining access to secret knowledge about the way the universe works. And if you gain access to this knowledge, you also gain power. Now you know how to do something that other people don't do, and they're going to pay you to gain access to that knowledge. All right? So Gnosticism, one of the most famous mystery, what's called the mystery religions, was called the Eleusinian Mysteries. So you can read about that if you Google the Eleusinian Mysteries. It was something that was going on in Greece at the time. And there was a whole set of initiatory rites. You had like real harsh treatment to the body. You had to prepare yourself through this really intense training, and then you had to do these certain rites and rituals a certain way, and then you gained access to all this secret knowledge. And if you told anybody about it, they'd kill you. Right? So this is a major thing that's going on in the world that Paul is writing here. This Gnosticism, we've got, and the last piece of the Gnosticism was the body-spirit dualism. And what this means is all Gnostics have this basic idea in common. Your body, the flesh, your flesh is bad. It's a problem. And your spirit is good. So spirit good, body bad. And what this means is that the body, if you want to ascend these levels and get here to this visionary experience, your body is going to be an obstacle. It's going to be a problem if you want to get there. And so this, in Gnosticism, it's going to go one of two ways. One way, for some Gnostics, is the way that you deal with the badness of your body is you treat it harshly. This rigorous and intense set of trainings and practices that you engage in so that you can subdue your body so that it doesn't keep you from getting here. Make sense? The other form of body-spirit dualism, much more popular form, was, since my body's bad, it doesn't really matter what I do with it. I can indulge it in whatever way I want because it's my spirit, ultimately, that's making the ascent. My body doesn't matter. I'm just going to shed that off like a kernel when I'm done with it. Right? And so this is Gnosticism. These are all the different moving parts that are going on at the time. And all these elements we see as elements that are going on. Paul is going to specifically name them. The harsh treatment of the body. He's going to talk a lot about mysteries. So look with me there, for example, in Colossians 1. He writes this. He's speaking about how he's a minister of the gospel. And that God gave him this role that God gave Paul this role for the Colossians. And his job is, there at the end of verse 25, to make the word of God fully known, the, quote, mystery hidden for ages and generations, but now revealed to his saints. So Paul is doing the same thing. But this is the crazy thing. He is going to totally blow up this whole scheme. And he's going to turn it on its head. And he's going to adopt some of the language, but he's going to show how this is a totally backward system. Everything about this system is a problem. So he's going to adopt the language and then give all these words new meaning. It's pretty fascinating. I mean, Paul is an excellent thinker, right? He sits with this heresy, this false teaching, and he understands it, and he grasps it, and then he thinks to himself, and under the inspiration of the Spirit, how can I address these Christians in this time, in this place, and help them understand the danger that they're really facing? And the way he's going to do it amazingly is not by creating an entire set of ideas different, but he's going to take their own language and he's going to use it against them. It's a pretty amazing tactic. So this is the basic heresy that's going on. All these elements seem to be contributing elements to whatever this false teacher was doing. Last and really, really, really important part of this heresy. If you want to ascend to these levels, you're going to need somebody to help you. You're going to need a guide. And that's what this false teacher was. He was a guide. But here's the catch. If he's going to guide you, and if you're going to get access to this secret knowledge and the protection of these angels, guess what you're going to have to do? Pay. You're going to have to pay. For a special price for you today, my friend. You're going to have to pay to play. If you want to get to the place where you have a vision of God, it's going to cost you. But if you pay me, I can help you. I can guide you through this whole process. And then you will have this experience, the language that you heard me talk about on Sunday, you will have this experience of fullness. Right? That's the scheme. Okay. So now with this in mind, this is what's going on in Colossae. These ideas are being shared and talked about in the life of the church, and some people are confused about it, and some people are like, this seems really appealing and really amazing. I mean, think about the fullness that we could achieve. Think about the secret knowledge that we could gain access to. And there's a lot of dispute happening in the church, and so Paul is going to write. He's going to write to them, and he's going to counter it. And he's going to counter it with a very simple idea that Jesus Christ is supreme and sufficient. Yeah.
Are these practices at that time, are they ancient practices, or are they new to that time?
Some of them were just beginning to emerge. So if you go back into the history of the time, a lot of the Jewish mystical elements were pretty new, that were occurring kind of what's called the intertestamental period. So after the temple is destroyed, and then the period leading up to the time of Jesus, basically this window of several hundred years. This is when some of these practices start to emerge. So there's different groups, Jewish groups like the Essenes, that seem to be inclined towards some of these practices. But they're still pretty new, I mean, in terms of showing up on the scene. The folk religious practices, those are as old as the day is blue. You know, they've been around for a really, really, really long time. And if you go to many tribal places in the world today, these are still practices that are happening today.
There must have been some piece of parchment.
Yeah.
For him to get that point across.
Yeah. Seriously. There's a lot going on.
Well, contacting all the way back to Genesis 6, the fallen sons of God that cohabitated with women or whatever, and Nephilim are the ones that imparted all the way back to the beginning of time, started imparting this super high knowledge to, they can steel and iron and weapons and agriculture and all that. It was all the way back to Genesis.
Yeah, so some of this is very old, and then some of its practition, the way it was practiced in this context is pretty new. So like the Merkaba mysticism, like it really starts developing right about this time in history. And it becomes pretty popular in the next couple hundred years. Same with Gnosticism, which doesn't really exist in any kind of cohesive way until several hundred years later. But these ideas are all kind of like, think of it like this, that like the Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment happened in the 1800s, but we didn't really know what the impact of those ideas would be until like 200 years later, and now here we are 200 years later, and we see the impact of, say, the fact that anything that you can really know, you can know only by your senses. Seeing, tasting, touching, smelling. This is really what you can know. So what we can't know about is anything spiritual, right? Well, where that's led is, basically like things that are spiritual don't exist anymore. And, well, that's the impact of an idea, but it takes several hundred years for it to kind of work itself into the culture. And that's to some degree what's going on here as well.
Just curious, the timing, it seems like within 30 years of the beginning of the church at that time, and want to kind of stirred things up, maybe brought new life to some of these practices, or if there were an outrigger of that.
Yeah, and you're going to see it in, so this is like if you read the book of Ephesians, for example, it's not that Paul is going to deny that there's a throne on which God sits that you can see. He's going to talk about this. But he's going to talk about it in a totally different way. And so if you go to Ephesians 1 and read Ephesians 1, go read what he tells you about Christ being seated at the right hand of God. And he wants the eyes of our hearts to be enlightened so that we would know what's been given to us, right? So he uses this language and these ideas, but he's going to flip it all on its head. So how does he counter this false teaching? So first thing he's going to do is he's going to write about he's going to have a center, a basic argument. Jesus is supreme above all the powers, angelic, elemental, and demonic. So Jesus is supreme above all the powers. This is a text we're going to be preaching on this Sunday. Verse 15 of chapter 1, second half, he says, he's the firstborn of all creation, for by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. All those words, thrones, dominions, authorities, rulers, all that, he's talking about spiritual powers. Angels, demons, elemental forces, and he's saying, he's not denying their existence. All he's saying is they were made by Jesus and for Jesus. In other words, to the Colossians, why are you subjecting yourself to them? They're subjected to Jesus, and you have Christ. Right? So Jesus is supreme, and not only that, Jesus is sufficient to liberate, protect, and guide the Colossians. In other words, Jesus is sufficient to protect you from all these elemental forces. You get this idea in 1 Timothy. He has this weird verse about women will be saved through childbirth. Any of you ever read that one before? Yeah. And you're like, what is he? Like, what is he talking about? And your inclination is to read it something like this, like, well, if women have children, then they're going to be saved. Well, that is not what he's talking about. What he's talking about is he's writing to Timothy, who was the pastor of the church in Ephesus. And Ephesus had one of the 7 wonders of the world in its city, the temple of Artemis. And Artemis had a whole bunch of priestesses. And Artemis, one of her primary jobs was to protect women during childbirth. That was one of her primary jobs. And basically what Paul is telling Timothy is you don't need Artemis to protect you. She will not save you in childbirth. Who will save you? Jesus, thank you. Yes. Jesus will save you. Jesus will save you. That's what will save you. Not Artemis, not her priestesses, not her, amulets and incantations that you have to go get from the priestesses at the temple of Artemis. Jesus is far superior to Artemis, and he is able to protect you. He is able to save you in childbirth, not Artemis. So, you women who have had children, there you go. You still are saved by Jesus, not because you've had children. So, all right. So, he's going to take this idea that Jesus is supreme and sufficient, and he's going to use it against all the different parts of this false teaching. That's what he's going to do. So he's going to write against private visions. So, what we've already read there in verse 18, let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism and the worship of angels, or going on in detail about visions, puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind. So, what we're going to see, it's not so much that Paul is opposed to people having private or personal experiences of God. That's not what he's opposed to. Paul himself was converted to Jesus by a personal experience, right? Jesus shows up on the road to Damascus. It's not that he's opposed to this in and of itself. He's also going to have a later experience at some time later in where he gets caught up into the third heaven. So it's not that he's saying you can't have personal experiences of God. What he is going to argue against is he's going to be opposed to these visionary experiences as the sole basis of a teacher's authority and revelation. So whatever the teacher is teaching and his authority to teach it is not based on these experiences. Why? Why? Well, there's a pretty simple reason why. Let's say Mark comes into the class in a couple weeks and says, guys, I had this crazy experience. And Jesus appeared to me. And he said X, Y, and Z. Okay. Well, how do I know that Mark had that experience? The only access to that experience I have is through Mark telling me. So could he be lying about that experience? He certainly could be. Could he himself be deceived about that experience? He certainly could be. So there's no way I don't have access to that experience. Not only that, but if Mark's interpretation is Jesus told me X, Y, and Z, and so this is what we need to do, well, how do I know that his interpretation of that experience is correct? Again, I have only Mark to tell me. I don't have any other way of knowing that. I have no way of verifying if what he's telling me is true or not. I just kind of have to take his word for it. Right? This creates real problems. Real problems. Why? Because visions, as the sole basis of authority and revelation, can lead to all kinds of manipulation, control, and ultimately abuse from a narcissistic leader. We have an entire religious faith in the United States based on precisely this. It's called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And we have one leader who has his own personal private experience out of which he builds an entire system. And if you go back to the early accounts of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you will see all kinds of manipulation, control, and abuse that were happening at that time. And this is why in the New Testament, leaders in the church are not qualified by their own personal or private experiences. So when Mark became an elder at Mission Hills Church, we didn't ask him, so tell me about your visions of Jesus. And give me them in precise detail, and how frequently would you say those are, and how meaningful have they been to you? Right? We don't ask leaders that in the church because we don't have access to that. What we do ask is about their public character, what everybody can know about them. Not what Mark can only know about himself, but what does Clint know about Mark? And what does Chris know about Mark? Right? What does Amy know about Mark? Then we can actually have access. What kind of person is he? Not how great were his visions. And so Paul is going to write, and he's going to write against a leader who's puffed up, right? Who's using his visionary experiences as an opportunity to claim authority in people's lives. So, he's going to write against this. And Paul, instead of elevating private experiences, is going to elevate one public event. That public event is the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So if you look with me, Colossians chapter 2, starting in verse 13, he says, "And you who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him." What Paul is going to do is, I don't have access to other people's personal, private experiences. But you know what we all have access to? Is whether or not Jesus actually died on the cross and actually rose from the dead. We can verify that. We can test that. We can examine that. We can scrutinize that and determine whether or not that really happened. I can't determine anything about Mark's private visionary experience. I can determine the reality of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is exactly what Paul will argue in 1 Corinthians. Look, if you're a follower of Jesus and Christ has not actually been risen from the dead, you're a fool to follow this, right? Our entire faith hangs on whether or not this actually happened in public, that's accessible to all people. So, you can test whether or not the resurrection actually happened, right? There's been great books written about this, about the eyewitness accounts, about counter narratives that have been put forward and how they don't explain all the detail. There's all kinds of weird details in the stories. There's about Jesus' resurrection that all of them, if you hold all of them together, the best explanation of the evidence is that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And so we can make an actual historical argument about whether or not this happened. But now whether or not somebody had a private visionary experience, I don't know. We can't verify that. And so Paul is going to want to base the confidence of the Colossians not on this man's personal experiences, but on the death and resurrection of Jesus. So he's going to write against private visions, and then he's also going to write against secret knowledge. Rather than exalting secret knowledge available to a few, Paul will exalt public revelation available to all. So, all these heresies tend to be obsessed with secret knowledge, these mysteries, and these leaders will promise access to secret knowledge. I'll just say this as an aside. There's a lot of this in modern America today. It just doesn't look like Gnosticism. It's not as woo-woo weird. But you go to any hotel in any city in America in any given weekend, and there's some huckster selling access to special knowledge if you just pay them a special price. If you pay them the price, they're going to tell you how to make more money or, solve this particular business problem or personal life problem, right? If you just pay this price, then you will get access to the knowledge you really need.
You don't have to go to a hotel, you can just go to Facebook or something.
Yeah, that's right. Very, very, very true. So this visionary leader will promise access to secret knowledge, which will unlock potential power and opportunity for all those who come to possess the knowledge. And what is going to be the basis of their authority, like I said, is their visionary experience, and they're going to be able to say, I have this secret knowledge that you don't have. And the way they establish this, the way they establish their authority, is by going on in detail about their vision. The more detail you give, the more real it seems. This is one of my good friends in college. His name was Eric Doswald, and we had something called the Doswald factor. And the Doswald factor was basically this, that we had a multiplier that we used on any story that he told us. Right? It was a 3 times multiplier. Sometimes that meant we had to expand it by 3 times or shrink it by 3 times. But he would tell these wild and grandiose stories with incredibly precise detail, specifically about the size of something happening. How fast he was going skateboarding down a hill, right? Or how big the wave was that he was surfing. And so we just had to diminish it by 3 times, and then we would know, because he gave with such detail that it's like, oh my gosh, he must be telling the truth. This must be exactly what happened. And then everybody else that was there with him was like, well, shrink that down a bit. Okay? Well, the effect of giving detail is to make it seem more realistic. And this is what Paul warns about, that in verse 18, that whoever this teacher is going on in detail about his visions. He's trying to validate his position by adding extra flourish and detail. Lastly, as we already established, access to this secret knowledge is going to come at a price. What Paul's going to do here is this is a kind of a jujitsu move right here. He's going to use the momentum of his opponent against him. And rather than elevate these so-called mysteries that come at a cost and are only accessible to a privileged few who've gone through these special rites and rituals, Paul instead is going to offer the mystery of the gospel free of charge. What we read just a moments ago. Verse 26, 25. He's going to make the word of God fully known, the mystery hidden for ages and generations, but now revealed to his saints. To them God chose to make known how great among the Gentiles are the riches of the glory of this mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. And then he goes on in chapter 2, and he says this, that it is his earnest desire that they would reach all the riches of full assurance of understanding and the knowledge of God's mystery, which is Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Do you see the move that he makes here? He does 2 things. He says, there is a mystery. There is a secret knowledge. There is some thing that you need to know about the universe, about yourself, about the world that is critical that you know. And God has made that known. And it is accessible to all through the preaching of the gospel, free of charge. You don't need some shaman or witch doctor or spirit guide to get you here. You have been given access to God's presence through Christ without cost. It's offered to you free of charge, and it's offered to everyone publicly. So he writes against this secret knowledge. Not available to a special few, not available to the people who have enough money to be able to afford it, but available to all, free of charge. My knuckleheaded neighbor, who I don't like, he can have access to it just as much as I do. And so, in Jesus are going to be hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Right? He's the source of that hidden knowledge. He is the source of it all. And what he's going to tell them is you need to plumb the depths of Christ. Explore and get to know Christ, because in him you'll find all the treasures, everything that you could ever want to know about the meaning of the universe found in Jesus. He is this great mystery that is now revealed. And this is why Paul will repeatedly write about, in this letter, he'll talk about knowing Jesus. That knowledge, gnosis, right, is not about secret knowledge, but about knowing Jesus. Okay, so he's going to write against secret knowledge. He's going to write against private visions. He's also going to write against angelic and elemental powers. These exalted angels that we talked about, these guardians of secret knowledge and access to God, and the stoicheia, these elementary spirits that you could only be defended against through these angelic powers. And the only way to get their protection was through this rigorous form of asceticism and, keeping the law of God perfectly and without flaw. If you wanted to have personal security and access to this fullness, you had to be the best at these things. And so what Paul's going to do, he's not going to deny the existence of angels and demons and spirits. But what he's going to say is they're all subjected to Jesus. And Jesus is going to assert his absolute sovereignty and triumph over them. The passage we read in Colossians 2, in verse 15, he writes, "He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him." In other words, what Paul is saying is he's canceled out their power. He triumphed over them. And you have access to God. This is Paul's argument, for example, in Ephesians 2. We all have access by him, by Jesus, through one Spirit to the Father. They have no authority to keep you out of God's presence. That's what he's saying. He's triumphed over them. He's exposed them. He's shown how weak and incapable they actually are. And he's defeated them. And so through Jesus, you have access to God. You already have access to the fullness that you so deeply desire. And so that's why Paul is going to say, why would you subject yourself to these guys again? That seems foolish. You already have access to the place you want to get to. Why would you then go back and say, well, I want to start back at the beginning and I want to go through this process because I really need to submit myself to them? Paul, why? Why would you do that? Don't get taken captive. Don't fall under deceit. This is what he says in verse 20. If with Christ you died to the elementary spirits of the world, why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? Why would you do this? This is crazy thinking. Think of it like this. When my kids were little, I told them that they couldn't play in the street. You guys know this basic rule, right? Kids can't play in the street when they're little. It's dangerous, right? The problem with that is, as my kids got older, my littler ones would watch my bigger ones play in the street. And how do I convince them that they should not do what their siblings are doing, right? Well, the reason why I'm holding this rule for the littler ones is they haven't matured yet enough. Like, one day I hope they mature enough to be able to play in the street and throw the football and skateboard and ride their bikes in the street because they know when a car's coming, they got to get out of the way. But when you're a 2-year-old little girl, you don't know what that means, right? It would be weird, though, if my 18-year-old son were still standing on the side of the street today being like, I don't know. I don't know if I can play in the street anymore. It'd be weird. All of a sudden, let's just say he comes home from college and he's like, Dad, I don't think it's safe for me to play in the street anymore. That's what Paul is saying. Why would you go back to that? You can play in the street. Have a great time. Don't eat, don't taste, don't touch, don't... What are you talking about? Eat, taste. You're free. Right? That's what he's saying. But you guys are all going back to this, like you can't play and have fun anymore. Why would you do that? So he writes to them against these elementary powers. He says, don't go back. And lastly, against ascetic practice. So, as we talked about, these practices of kind of the harsh treatment of the body and the kind of keeping of the law to its perfection, the assumption is that if you do this, you'll find fulfillment and protection. Here's one of my new favorite words, scrupulosity. Ooh, I like that word. Right? Somebody who's scrupulous, who's trying to just keep everything in perfect detail. Right? That the thought is, what we would call, that's like OCD, right? Obsessive compulsive disorder, right? This is like one of my friends who he for years struggled with leaving the house because he was always worried that he didn't turn the oven off, right? It's just like obsessing over this detail, right? And the only way to know that I'm safe is I got to go back and check 3 or 4 or 5 times, right? Well, this is the way people related to God's law. I got to make sure I can't screw it up because if I forget to turn the oven off, the house is going to blow up. Right? This is the way people related to God's law. If I don't do it perfectly and exactly, my life's going to blow up. And these evil spirits are going to attack me and all these kinds of things. So I got to keep these things perfectly. And instead, what Paul does, amazingly, is instead of keeping these ascetic practices, what he says is they only worsen the human condition. They only make things worse for you. They don't make things better, they make it worse. He saw them as having no value in addressing the real problems of the human heart. In fact, they would do the opposite. They would actually aggravate the problems of the human heart. In effect, these practices, rather than liberating the human soul from bondage, only deepened its bondage and became a source of pride. So that's what he says here, verse 23. These have the appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. Here's what he's saying. And this is true of any form of devotion that becomes like this. I'm better than you because of how strictly I keep my devotional life. I'm better than you because of how strictly I adhere to my Christian practices. I've seen greater things than you. I've had more impressive visions than you. This is actually what Paul warns about with his own visionary experience in 2 Corinthians 12. He saw these crazy things. And then he writes, well, God had to keep me humble because of it. And so he gave me a thorn in my flesh to torment me. Right? The temptation is always, if you have crazy visions or if you are really devout, is to begin to think of yourself as better than others because of how rigorous I am and how closely I adhere to these things. And Paul warns against it. It's actually just, all it's doing is making you more and more arrogant. Instead, what he's going to do is commend walking in the way of Jesus in obedience. This is what's going to bring freedom. And Paul's scheme is this. Obedience doesn't set you free. You are already free. What Christ has done for you on the cross has set you free. Now, what obedience is you living out and walking in the freedom that has been given to you. So, for example, this is a good way to think about it. The people of Israel, right? The story of the Exodus from Egypt. They were slaves in Egypt for hundreds of years, and God does this amazing thing, delivers them from slavery. And they get out, and they think, hey, this is great. We're out of slavery. Awesome. God just did these awesome things. And then the next place they end up, they think things are going to be just up and up and up. The next place they end up, where do they end up? The stinking desert, right? Why? Why do they end up in the desert? Well, there's one really important reason. They had been taken out of Egypt, but Egypt had not yet been taken out of them. And what we come to see as they wander through the wilderness is they'd actually be inclined to go back to slavery. Like, that sounded pretty good. And we hear this throughout the story of the Exodus. They will talk about, oh, remember when we had leeks and onions and meat? Oh, those were the good old days. We only had to pay the small price of enslavement to Pharaoh, but at least we had leeks and onions. This is a problem. And that bonded heart that was thinking, well, it's worth it. Slavery's worth it as long as I have, something to fill my belly. And Paul is going to warn against this kind of thinking. Why would you go back to that? You have already been given freedom. And the problem is that you don't know what it is to walk in that freedom yet. You don't really know. And the whole point of them not being given food for 75 days, but given only enough food for one day, right? The bread that came down from heaven, is to teach them about true spiritual freedom. You don't have to worry about tomorrow. That's true freedom. That's true freedom. And so God, every day for 40 years, you get enough food for today, except one day of the week, you get enough for the Sabbath. And if you collect more than that, guess what? Stinks. It's going to be eaten by worms, right? You don't need to worry about tomorrow. That's true spiritual freedom. And so he was training them as they walked through the wilderness to walk in the freedom that had been given to them. And this is exactly what Paul is going to say. Hey, you've already been given this fullness. This freedom has already been purchased for you. And now, everything that he says in Colossians 3 and on is basically, now go live out that freedom. Go enjoy your freedom. It's one of my favorite bumper stickers that I saw recently. Enjoy your forgiveness. I like that. Right? Go out and walk and enjoy your forgiveness. Live out the freedom that has been given to you. It would be weird, and this is actually what we know happened, for example, in the American South after the Civil War, is that a lot of the slaves that had been freed, they stayed on the plantations that they had been freed from and kept working it because they didn't know another life beyond that. And it took decades and generations, and it's still taking time to work out some of the trauma of what that was, right? And what Paul is saying is, don't live on the plantation owner's property anymore. Go live in the freedom you've been given. You don't need this guy to give it to you. You don't need his teaching. Christ has already given you everything. That's what Paul is going to argue here. So, I think we're about near stopping time. Let me just open it up to any questions, comments, thoughts, reflections, criticisms, harsh words, or anything else you might have.
No harsh words. That's great.
As usual, I have a question and a comment, but yeah, I think you answered my question. So your triangles there, that's all the powers of darkness. That's because there are, we both agree there's a hierarchy of sons of spirit, the spiritual creation that have not fallen, that are good, but this is all the fallen ones.
These angels, just by the way, I didn't say this, they're bad guys too, right?
Okay, that's what
so in the spiritual realm, there's a book that I recently read called, it's blanking on me right now. You Are Mine. That's the name of it. You Are Mine. It's the story of a young lady who was like a Wiccan priestess, and she came to faith in Jesus. Crazy story. Amazing book. But one of the things she talks about is in her encounters with spirits, she called them spirits of light and spirits of darkness. But what she came to discover is that the spirits of light were just as evil as the spirits of darkness. That it was all about manipulation. That, this is what Paul warns against even. He says that Satan masquerades as an angel of light. And so these aren't real angels. They are actually just deceptive spirits that masquerade as spirits of light. So, yeah.
The other thing is that you mentioned like the LDS, but it's still going. It's even kind of gone into the evangelical world with the NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation.
I haven't read enough about that to speak knowledgeably.
It's totally wrong, but this is in what you would call evangelical churches that that these people, these apostles have special revelation from God, and they control like multiple different like a region of all the churches in the area, and they have some special revelation and make prophecies and everything.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
called NAR, New Apostolic
Yeah,
Revelation.
watch out for that.
Yeah, very bad. But it's like it's all over California.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll have to check that out. I haven't heard much about that. That's interesting. Yeah. You were going to say something, Clint?
Yeah, is it sort of like ayahuasca is a big thing now,
Mhm.
and treatment of that?
Mhm.
Is that similar? Because it sounds kind of similar.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so a lot of these, I didn't really talk much about this, but part of the initiation rites and rituals that were in Gnosticism, Jewish mysticism, folk religion, many of them used what we would now today call psychedelics as part of their rites and rituals. And so this was very much a part of the ancient practice. We know that from all kinds of records that have been kept. So we know, for example, that what I mentioned, the Eleusinian mysteries, there were psychoactive elements in the potions that they would make that they had to drink. And so that was certainly a part of what was going on then. And definitely, like, this has really reemerged strongly in the last, I'd say 5 to 10 years in our culture of the use of psychedelics and all these different things that people are encountering as they go on these psychedelic trips. So, yeah, very similar.
It is, but it seems to really help some people,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
Mhm.
And I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just
Sure.
trying to wrap my mind around, like, some people come back and they say, hey, my world's changed, I'm great.
Yeah.
Especially like soldiers and PTSD
Yeah,
and
yeah.
things of that nature.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I'm not making an argument one way or the other about the use of psychedelics. Like any substance can likely be used for medicinal and healing purposes. What I am making an argument against is how it's popularly used. I would make an argument against how it's popularly used and even recreationally used. And these are if you've done any reading on it, these are people called the psychonauts. that they go on these trips, spiritual trips through the use of ayahuasca and peyote and other psychedelics. And so there's one thing to be said about treating a soldier who has PTSD and like a 14-year-old boy in San Marcos who's like, ooh, psychedelics sound super cool. And there's a real difference there, and also how they're used and employed, and a lot of the use of them, especially in like folk and tribal stuff even today, is associated with evil spirits. It's associated with false religion and all those kinds of things. So the moment you step into that world, you're really entering it and opening yourself up. And this is the one thing I would say about it is once you open a door like that, you don't necessarily always have control over how it's closed. And you open yourself up to, and I have friends who've had these experiences, so I'm very aware of some of this stuff, and I would, at a minimum level say it's probably not a good thing unless you have a certain kind of condition that needs to be treated. And then we could have a discussion about the usefulness of that, which I don't know enough about to speak knowledgeably about, but I'm not going to close it off, out the gate and say, if you're a veteran of Afghanistan war and your brain is freaking out, like, okay, well, maybe there's something there that we can look at. But so, does that help? Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions? Yeah.
Maybe an observation. I'm just walking out of here. I'm grateful for the context of this book, because having read the book and not having the context is just remarkable. What I just experienced in the last 90 minutes. So thank you for doing the homework to really put this together. It really is a much more interesting view for me of the book of Colossians. So.
Yeah, my hope is as you read through it, it will start kind of lighting up some of the language in Colossians. So when you read Paul use language like knowledge or mystery or fullness, like you'll get a better sense of why he's using those specific words, because he's not just like throwing those words because it sounds super cool, or because he has some, doctrinal or theological scheme. He's like, no, these are the words you guys are using, and I'm going to tell you how to think about that as a Christian. So
It's a great way to look at all the books, right?
Yeah.
You say, what is the context? What was going on then?
Yeah.
We
So
keep
thank you.
forgetting that, or we read the Bible like it was written to us in 2025
Yeah.
instead of the first century. It wasn't written to us, it was
Yeah.
written for us, but not to us. And
Yeah.
we always forget that and
Yeah.
try and interpret everything as if it was to us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Let me pray, and then I'll let you guys go. Father, thank you for today, and I know that what we just did was a pretty deep dive into the world that this letter was written in. And Father, my prayer is that whatever is useful for us, whatever is helpful for us in our growth, maybe it's one small thing from tonight, that we would take that and hold on to that and grow from that. And but that also you would make us students of your word, that we would be compelled by what you have written and see for ourselves, Lord, the richness and fullness of what's been given to us in Jesus Christ. That indeed in him are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge, and that we would be compelled to plumb the depth of those treasures, to explore all that you have given us in Christ and find our life in him. Would you bless us as we go? And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.